The long 18th century wasn't exactly known for clemency, and if you were a soldier or a sailor, perhaps you were found drunk on duty, well then of the wide variety of tortures that were available to your officers, a good flogging could well be their brutality of choice. We've all seen examples of it in books and films, stories of horrible flogging captains who beat their men senseless for every minor infraction. But our modern understanding correctly informs us that one of the worst things that you can do to a soldier is to render him unfit for service. So what is flogging really? Was it so bad as it's always made out to be? And how common of a punishment was it really? All of that and more in this admittedly rather unpleasant, rather grim video brought to you by the Native Oak and sponsored by something far more pleasant, Helix. Part the first. What was flogging? Flogging, whipping, flagellation, there are all sorts of little variations on the theme, but for the British military of the long 18th century, they generally pointed to this, the cat o' nine tails. The Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue, as printed in 1796, describes it as a scourge composed of 9 strings of whipcord, each string having 9 knots. Although the number of knots could vary alongside the thickness, the size, and what kind of cord or line that the thing was made out of. Now, depending on its application, this was a tool of discipline and punishment, or of brutal torture, even a particularly slow method of execution. Now, a well-made cat swung by a particularly eager bosun's mate or a drummer could easily pierce flesh and quickly turn one's back into a bit of a mess. In the Royal Navy, these beatings were generally issued by the bosun's mates, in the Army by drummers. In the former, a sailor might be tied up against a bulkhead or strung out over a cannon, and the Army could also lay men over the carriage of a gun or some other wagon, but a stout tree would be of equal service. Or, alternatively, the sergeants might stack up their halberds and thus create a temporary flogging post. Now, the number of lashes that a man was to receive would naturally vary on the nature of his crime and potentially on the temperament of the punishing body. Lesser crimes may receive less than a dozen strikes, while something like a desertion or mutiny, there were really big ticket items, they could see hundreds, even over 1,000 lashes ordered. Likewise, a man may receive clemency during his punishment, for example, if he falls unconscious, with it being decided that, he's suffered enough, so all right, well, he only got like 150 out of the 200, let him down anyways, he's suffered enough. Or, alternatively, a surgeon may bring him back to consciousness, specifically that he may continue to endure that punishment. Again, it's going to depend an awful lot on the particular situation. Now, a mutineer may be flogged around the fleet, where he is rowed from ship to ship, receiving a number of lashes on each one, that a whole squadron might witness the punishment. Or a thief might be made to run a gauntlet, where every one of his shipmates or fellow soldiers is going to be striking him as he moves between them all. Anyone holding back from striking him, then of course you have a wonderful way to accuse them of being complicit in the crime. But in any case, it was always important, whatever the form it takes, it's always important that the flogging be a public event. The entire force, be it on land or at sea, being drawn up in formation to bear witness, as much a warning to the others as a punishment to the condemned. Flogging is something that we usually associate with the Navy, but it's important to remember that it was used by the land forces as well. The 1778 Articles of War for the Army prescribed a corporal punishment, which might include flogging, for a wide variety of crimes, including drunkenness, embezzlement, the wasting or sabotage of ammunition or one's uniform, 50 I got for selling me coat, and all that, the Rogues March. As well as for the issuing, for example, of an illegal duel, or, of course, for threatening violence towards a minister of God. So that's flogging, and yikes, it sounds pretty rough. But when it comes to history, we all know how much people love to exaggerate the brutalities. It can be almost perverse at times, the amount that people focus on and really amplify, if you will, the worst elements of the past. Listening to some stories, you'd have to wonder how any military of this time period ever got anything done, constantly torturing and defiling its own people so terribly. The old myth of the scum of the earth soldiery, who were only ever led by fear and they were hated by their own officers. It's a load of nonsense. It's completely false. That was not the case, as we've discussed on this channel before. So what's the catch? Was flogging really that bad? Well, yes, actually, in the sense of the word, it really was. Flogging was a brutal punishment, and in the hands of a bad agent, it could even be a real instrument of torture. In fact, here's that classic name again. You all know him, you all love him. In his System for the Management of a Battalion of Infantry, Bennett Cuthbertson writes the following as regards flogging. Quote, "Whenever the regiment is under arms, the drum major should have his apparatus for whipping constantly with him, as it sometimes happens that courts-martial are necessary at the drumhead, and that the execution of their sentence should be immediate in order to strike the greater terror. And as he must have a proper supply of instruments used on such occasions, a fund should be established for that purpose, by an allowance to him of 2d for every 100 lashes inflicted, to be stopped from the delinquent's pay as an addition to his punishment." So if the flogging wasn't bad enough, the man even had to pay for the privilege of being whipped. But note there that very specific word that he uses, terror. Like I said, as much a tool for the control of the whole as the punishment of the individual. It was considered that the fear of the lash alone was a strong deterrent to many offenses, and indeed it seems to have been. To many men, the threat of hundreds of lashes was far worse than a quick death. In some instances, men would beg for execution over flogging. One sailor wrote, quote, "I am sure that I cannot go through with this torture. I would rather have been sentenced to be shot or hung from the yardarm." End quote. Another quote reads, quote, "When a poor fellow is being punished, his agonizing cries pierce you to the soul. The scene is awful. Hot boiling lead poured on a criminal's back would be but in comparison to the suffering of those who come under the lash of the unrelenting boatswain's mates." End quote. One account describes the effects of repeated lashes on a man who had been flogged around the fleet, and how, quote, "his back swelled like a pillow, black and blue. Some sheets of thick blue paper were steeped in vinegar and laid to his back. Before, he seemed insensible. Now his shrieks rent the air." End quote. When soldiers and sailors were issued beatings in upwards of 200 or 300 lashes, death could well be a result of that. But unlike a hanging or a firing squad, that death is rarely going to come quickly. In 1801, Private Alexander, there's a name for you, was stationed in Chatham when a soldier of the 9th Regiment of Foot was found asleep while on duty. General Sir John Moore is regarded today as a great British hero, but out of necessity for the times, he was also a harsh disciplinarian, and he also happened to be in charge of that particular division at that time. He had the man tried by court-martial, and despite the appeal of multiple officers for clemency, as this was a good soldier, the general was informed, still the general ordered the man to be flogged. Private Alexander writes of the following, quote, "All the troops were paraded to witness the punishment. It was a very stormy morning. The frost, which had continued for some days, gave way during the night, and the wind and sleet drove most piteously. It was a severe punishment to stand clothed looking on, how much more so to be stripped to the waist and tied up to the halberts. The poor fellow got 229 lashes, but they were uncommonly severe. I saw the drum major strike a drummer to the ground for not using his strength sufficiently. At length, the surgeon interfered. The poor fellow's back was black as the darkest mahogany and dreadfully swelled. The cats being too thick, they did not cut, which made the punishment more severe. He was instantly taken down and carried to the hospital, where he died in 8 days afterwards, his back having mortified. It was the cold, I think, that killed him, for I have often seen 700 lashes inflicted, but I never saw a man's back so horrible to look upon." End quote. However, it must be pointed out that not every instance of flogging, even with so many lashes, was quite as brutal as that. I mean, as the fellow just mentioned, he had seen more lashes done before without so much damage. It wasn't a guaranteed death sentence. You can imagine that if it was, it wouldn't be referred to in the Articles of War as a punishment separate from death, as a corporal punishment as opposed to a capital punishment. This is for less severe crimes. Severe, to be sure, but not so severe as to warrant killing the man. More often than not, the men would survive this act, even if perhaps at the moment itself they wished that they would not be alive to experience that terrible pain. Rifleman Harris, for example, recalls in his memoirs the story of a certain Private Daniel Howans, who was sentenced to 300 lashes after he insulted a general at a time when the army was very nearly falling apart and discipline was of the utmost importance. Harris recalls, quote, "There was some difficulty in finding a place to tie Howans up, as the Light Brigade carried no halberts. However, they led him to a slender ash tree which grew near at hand. 'Don't trouble yourselves about tying me up,' said Howans, folding his arms. 'I'll take my punishment like a man.' He did so without a murmur, receiving the whole 300. End quote. Later on the march, the man's wife was seen by Harris carrying the soldier's pack, as Howans' back had become too severely cut to allow for it. So, flogging was pretty brutal. There's really no way around that simple fact. Even when it was being lightly given, it was not a light punishment. Perhaps some of the culture around flogging might be exaggerated, exactly how common it was, things like that. We'll explore that in the next section. But at least for the action itself, the actual deed, it'd be difficult, I think, to exaggerate just how awful it could potentially be. But even if you don't take my word for it, and even if you don't believe those various historical examples, you think, oh, they're exaggerating for dramatic effect to sell books or something, well then, my dear viewer, have I got a treat for you. Because a few weeks ago, at the Battle of Bennington reenactment in upstate New York in Walloomsac, I had the pleasure to meet with a man who has actually had the distinct displeasure of having been flogged. Not like in a bad way, not like that, like the historic flogging, the historic punishment. Roll a clip.
Hello, my name is Marsud Acuna of the King's Regiment in the American Revolution when it comes to reenacting or living history. One of the more interesting stories that I'm going to share with you is one that I hope you never have an opportunity to recreate, and there's a reason for that. This was not in the American Revolution, and it's not part of the organizations that I'm currently with, but in the past, I had the opportunity to recreate getting flogged. The way this worked is that I actually committed offenses that were quite real for the 18th and 19th century militaries. I abandoned my post, I was drinking while on duty. I incited others to also do the same. I may have also spit in the major's face when I was questioned about this. Part of the scenario was that we were going to basically demonstrate 18th century and 19th century corporal punishment. So as part of the process, as was the case, I was placed above the drumhead, my hands tied to the poles, and in this case in front of an artillery piece. The drummer actually took out a cat of nine tails from a velvet bag. It's actually my own cat of nine tails with turkey's head knots, so this is an accurate one. The interesting part is that during this process, it was all quite well coordinated and quite respectful. Everyone took their turn who was supposed to in the regiment, starting again with the drummers, and then the sergeants, and then some of the other men. They all were very careful with this. There was no injuries. There was one mistake at one point, and the person afterwards felt quite guilty. But after this, we had an interesting situation, and this is why hopefully it doesn't happen again, and that was a lack of consent. One individual took it upon themselves to actually take 5 real strikes. The public wasn't quite aware of what was going on, because I guess I was acting rather well in terms of my reaction whenever we were getting hit. But again, my friends were quite good, and they put a stop to this right away. The result, though, is that I actually had the opportunity to take 6 real lashes with the cat of nine tails. And I can tell you, it is as horrific as you may have heard. It's rather unpleasant. It stings at first, and it just gets progressively worse after that for about an hour or two. Thankfully, it was only 6, the one accidental one, and then the 5 after that. And again, this was put to an end right away. The matter was dealt with, and it was not during the American Revolution or unit I'm part with right now, but it is an interesting experience. The accounts that we've read about in terms of soldiers recovering from this, how it actually felt, it's rather accurate. So the wounds themselves, I could say, took about a week to heal. At first, they were just small lashes that just got larger as time went on. They became bruises after that. It's rather odd having to recover from an 18th century, 19th century infliction, but it is an interesting experience itself, being able to see what the effects are of having to recover from getting lashed. Thankfully, none of them really broke the skin, which we've heard horrible things about, where you have to apply things such as salt and other substances to try to clean the wound, so that wasn't a concern. It didn't get that far. And again, the men who were participating were very careful, and they put an end to this and took care of me right away. But it did take about a week to heal. But again, we can also take away that we should always be doing things like this under extreme caution, if at all, which I honestly don't recommend doing again, and making sure you have consent whenever you're participating in anything like this. So if you're engaging in living history and these types of activities, be very careful. And again, I really don't recommend you do this. I learned from my experience. So for some perspective on this, how frequent was this the case? Well, in the American Revolution, again, this is not where this was taking place. The King's Regiment was a flogging regiment. It is a regiment that actually used this to punish the soldiers. This was extensively used in the War of 1812 as well. One incident involved a regiment that thought it was being sent to India when in fact it was being sent to Canada. And in that instance, the regiment as a whole, with the exception of a few sergeants and officers, mutinied. The result is that hundreds of men were sentenced to be flogged. Many of them were actually flogged to death. So we have instances of men being given small, what would be minor amounts, 20, 50 lashes. And then we have accounts where men are actually quite literally flogged to death. It's considered to be a waste of a soldier to kill a perfectly good soldier rather than to correct them. So this is something that was frowned upon by the British military. It's something that was used often to enforce discipline among the soldiers. But again, this is not something that was supposed to be commonly used. It was a deterrent more than anything else.
Like I said, pretty brutal stuff, even after only a very small number, admittedly, of accidental real lashes by, one negative actor. Marcio still had to recover from that for a week. And that's in a modern setting, with modern medical care, not on a rough, moving campaign with little food and water. He was hardly marching for 20 miles and then sleeping on the floor. He had a bed to enjoy. And oh, what a delightful transition that makes into our sponsor. This video is sponsored by Helix. Probably the biggest perk of YouTube being my job is that I get to set my own hours and I get to sleep whenever I like and for how long I like. I am a very big fan of sleep. Like I'm a bit too big of a fan of sleep. I tend to sleep a lot more than I honestly should. Hey, it's how I keep myself looking so young and cute, or that's what I tell myself. Anyways, I'm happy to say that this video is sponsored by Helix Sleep. Helix Sleep makes premium mattresses and bedding that are customized to you and are conveniently shipped in these more or less easy to carry boxes right to your front door. Helix knows that everyone sleeps differently, and that's why they made the Sleep Quiz to match your unique body type and sleeping preferences to your perfect mattress. You can even take the sleeping quiz with a partner if you want to find that perfect compromise. Now, I like a mattress that's a bit on the softer side, shocking I know, and I tend to sleep on my back. So when I took the quiz, I was recommended the Helix Moonlight, and in just a few days after that, it was sent right out to my front door, so I didn't even have to worry about getting any help to bring it up my stairs or setting the mattress up, because it was just a matter of cutting open the box and there it was. Now, I know it can feel kind of iffy buying a mattress that kind of inflates, from inside a box instead of this massive awkward cube you have to have like 3 people come to deliver it for you. But I was delighted with how comfortable it was while still feeling like it gives my back proper support. And with a 100-night sleep trial plus a 10-year warranty and flexible financing options, of course, there really isn't any risk involved with this. You get just over 3 months to decide if the mattress is for you, and if it's not, well then they'll come right back to your door and pick it up while giving you a full refund. And all that shipping is free within the US. So if you're looking for a new night's sleep, you can check out Helix by visiting the link down below, where you'll even get $200 off your new Helix Sleep mattress, plus 2 free pillows. Thank you to Helix for sponsoring this video, and now back to less than comfortable subjects. Part the third. How common was flogging, and why was it done? So with all that, how common was flogging really? How regularly were officers willing to put their perfectly good soldiers through such physical hardship, sometimes even ruining them permanently as a result? And how could such an activity ever be considered good soldiering? Well, an overall good cop-out answer to that is going to be, it really depends. The 18th century is a long time period, and a very varied time period as well. And on top of that, especially when it comes to the Navy, the actual extent of floggings is going to depend an awful lot on the conditions that individual groups of men are facing. If a ship or an army is facing really dire circumstances where, discipline is hanging on by a thread and the officers need to make a strong example to keep the force together, well, then you might expect a lot more than in some, easy peacetime garrison town or something like that. On the other hand, no matter what the material circumstances, sometimes you just had certain ships, certain captains, certain regiments where floggings were more a part of the culture than in others. Some captains were cruel, some colonels were kind. It's all going to depend on a lot of these particular situations. And of course, to say nothing of how it might vary from year to year based on various army and government regulations. Still, whatever they end up being, having some actual numbers is always going to be helpful to ground us in these sorts of questions. Like obviously, yes, it's all going to vary, but let's have some numbers all the same. In pursuit of those numbers, I found a great article on the blog British Tars, which I will link down below if you'd like to read some more, alongside some other amazing and very, very chilling first-hand accounts of flogging, including on board like slave ships and whatnot. The author cites a paper called Tyranny of the Lash, Punishments in the Royal Navy During the American War, and it provides a statistic from the sloop Wolf, where, quote, there were only 18 floggings in 5 1/3 years, giving a total of 276 lashes and an average of 15 lashes per flogging. 13 of the floggings were of 12 lashes and 5 of 24 lashes each. Only 15 individuals were subject to flogging. The 14 men flogged in the period 1776 to 80 amounted to 4.9% of all the seamen and marines who served with the ship in that period. So 5% of the men having been flogged, and most of those floggings were of fairly small amounts, not too much worse than our friend Marcio suffered, although presumably, yes, they were getting hit a little bit harder, given it was by professional sailors and not some salty reenactor. Other studies, which are cited in that blog, again, I'd recommend go read it after this video so you can get more of the context and everything, but other articles, other studies that he cites provide numbers between 5 and about 9%. But again, most of those numbers are coming from the latter half of the 18th century. Another article, unfortunately behind a paywall, but I'll link it below anyways, describes how floggings went up pretty dramatically after 1789 and the start of the French Revolution. Up until then, aka the years the previous example is going over, things were a lot more lax. So again, while those are really good numbers to have, don't expect that it's going to necessarily be the case throughout this entire, 120 plus year period that we're talking about here. It's also worth noting that there were regulations in place. There were laws to limit and control the extent to which flogging was used as a punishment. Not only do we have those distinctions in the Articles of War, both for the Navy and the Army both, of which crimes are to be punished by corporal punishment versus capital punishment or less severe forms, but we also have regulations limiting the number of lashes that could be given in any particular circumstance. In the Napoleonic Navy, for example, anything more than 36 lashes technically demanded the sentencing by a court-martial. And after the controversial death of a man, Frederick John White, at the hands of the Army in the 1840s, I think it was, then floggings in the Army were limited to 50 lashes at most. And that's a pretty common story throughout the time period in question, with increasingly stringent regulations and laws being placed around the act of flogging, how it could be carried out, when it was legal, how much was to be done, etc., etc. But of course, these laws and procedures are also not always going to be kept to the letter, as you may imagine. And again, we have a situation where the exact extent to which these official limitations are respected, it's going to vary by circumstance. If you're a Napoleonic captain in the middle of, the Southern Atlantic or something on some random patrol duty, and some guy tries to run away, and you're thinking, well, technically I'm supposed to write back home to England. It's no, you're probably not going to. You're just going to take care of business right then and there, aren't you? Overall, an important thing to understand is that while flogging was often popularly viewed as a method by which discipline could be maintained in the military, and it's being a powerful negative example in the eyes of the men, it wasn't viewed or engaged by that military in any universal fashion. For every flogging captain or flogging regiment, there was likely another which abhorred the practice and felt it overly cruel and inefficient. And as one final note, I'd like to mention something that may surprise many of you and which forces us, I think, to reconsider the nature of power in military structures during this time period, at least outside of those more narrow conflict theory type perspectives. What I'm basically saying here is it makes us reconsider the whole like, oh, the officers were evil and the men were just scared of them. Not quite. It's a lot more complicated than that. That is something that someone actually pointed out to me, this dynamic, in a comment some 5 years ago when I last touched on the subject of flogging. That in 1797, the Royal Navy saw 2 major mutinies, which I don't really have the time to get into them right now, but suffice to say, these mutinies were a really big deal. They shook the Royal Navy, and as such the entire nation, to its core for quite some time. But in them, while the mutineers listed quite a few very severe grievances and demanded a number of reforms and things like the removal of bad officers and whatnot, the practice of flogging wasn't actually mentioned among their demands. The mutineers had issue with a number of bad officers who were making overuse of the practice, but the actual practice itself, people overall seem to have understood was a necessary part of military discipline, or at the very least, they didn't have any expectation that it was going to go away. And similarly, if you think back to the Rifleman Harris example I gave earlier, well, that was the army flogging men for rather small infractions, verbal insults in that case, in a desperate retreat. And yet Harris viewed those floggings as necessary, and the general who ordered it as, while yes, a very strict man, as a man who, without his insistence on the discipline on that desperate march, Harris basically says that he thinks the army could well have dissolved, and that general, by being so strict, so harsh, so cruel by modern day standards, basically saved all those men's lives. To give you a sense of perspective with all that, flogging was only abolished in the army in 1881. The history of flogging is a complicated one. It was a brutal, harsh, and bloody business, absolutely. But then, it was a brutal, harsh, and bloody world. Flogging was just one of many different tools used by the military to maintain itself, for better and for worse. And which descriptor was more apt? Well, that was a thoroughly debated point then, as much as it may be today. So thank you all for watching, most particularly to those noble supporters of this channel on Patreon and Utreon, without whose patronage none of my work would be possible. Until the next time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.